Welcome to section 8.1, where we're going to focus on the idea of energy and how this relates to cells. So when we talk about energy, we need energy because it's what allows us to do work. And work is just the change in energy. So if we want to make something get built, that requires us to change the potential energy of that object to allow us to stick more atoms, more molecules together to get a bigger, more complicated structure. That change in energy, that increase in potential energy, is work. Just like when we break something down so we can extract the energy, something exothermic. Ultimately, that's a change in energy where we reduce its potential energy and convert that potential energy to a different chemical storage, or to heat, or to some other mechanism where energy is being released. So this fundamental idea that allows cells to function is the ability to do work, the ability to transform, to manipulate energy. Now, with this, though, there's two laws of thermodynamics we should understand, which kind of gives us the playbook, the rules that we're allowed to use when messing with energy. So with thermodynamics, the first law I think you guys have seen before. I don't think this is going to strike you guys as crazy. The first law is the idea that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be transformed. It can only be kind of shifted around. So this is kind of critical because this means cells have to get their energy from something else. We can't just make it out of nowhere. And so this is why when you look at life and you think of it as being a system, we have to have an input of energy from outside the system. Now normally this is going to be light, although in some cases this can be chemicals that we eat, but we need energy from somewhere else to keep us going. And this is also tied into and critical with the second law. And the second law says that yes, you can transform energy, but when you do, there's going to be this loss. And typically that loss is going to be given off as heat. So we're going to lose some energy as heat. Now this is so important because it tells us we can't just keep shifting energy back and forth between two separate organisms. We can't have one group of organisms that eats, so I guess group A, we can't have them eat some members of group B, take that energy and have some kids, and then group B eats some members of group A, takes that energy and has some kids, and this just keeps going as a loop. We can't have that because each time you try to convert energy from one form to another, we lose some of it to heat. And that heat then is lost from our system, and so that's kind of given off and it exits. So we need to have this constant input of energy at some level, typically the autotrophs that are going to get light. We have to have that input or else we're screwed, because there's always this loss when you transform energy. So where do we get energy? There's two basic ideas of how we can do this. The first we've mentioned before is autotrophs that normally get it from light, although some of them the chemoautotrophs instead of the photoautotrophs. The photoautotrophs are the ones that use light, and the chemoautotrophs are going to use chemicals. Not as common, but those deep sea thermal vents, those guys can use it. And so they're going to get energy from somewhere else, some other abiotic source. They will typically get the carbon they need to build stuff from just CO2 from the air, or from the water. If they're aquatic, CO2 dissolves into the water as well. So these guys can ultimately make their own organic chemicals. They can make their own food, they can make their own structural compounds, they can make their own proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates. Now for heterotrophs, we have to ultimately ingest or absorb from somebody else the energy and the carbon that we need. So humans, we don't use light or we don't use chemicals to make our own stuff that we just kind of gather from around us. We go through and we find an autotroph or another heterotroph and we eat a chunk of them, and that chunk of them contains the carbohydrates, nucleic acids, proteins, and lipids that we need so that we can build our own stuff and we can break them down to get energy. So all heterotrophs at some point depend upon autotrophs, because while I might eat another heterotroph, if we trace it back, that heterotroph at some point ate an autotroph because we need these autotrophs. Heterotrophs cannot take energy from outside kind of the living system to end up storing it and using it to make stuff. Only autotrophs can do that. So this is why we say pretty much all life on Earth is going to come back to relying primarily on the sun. That's almost all autotrophs are photosynthetic. They use the sun. But pretty much all of them are going to come back to needing this step where outside energy comes into the system. And then from there you can have stuff like the caterpillar that can eat the plant, and then from there the bird can eat the caterpillar, etc. But it all still hinges upon this initial autotroph idea These guys are the base of the food chain. Autotrophs are the most critical step. Without them, we're screwed. Now, metabolism is going to be the term that describes all the chemical reactions that go on within a living organism. Now, in general, we're going to focus on two of them. We've got the one type of reaction that's going to take this external energy, typically light energy, and use it to make organic chemicals. So it's going to be a building process. It's going to be making the organic stuff we need. And that is going to be photosynthesis. So this one's going to be the building process. So this one's going to make organics. And this will be done by those autotrophs. And then the second chemical reaction that we'll commonly talk about that's part of metabolism is cellular respiration. And so this one is typically where we break apart these organic compounds. And in the process, we're going to release energy as we break this stuff down, and we're going to store that energy in ATP. It's a lot like taking energy from something like burning coal or water moving and storing it in batteries so we can then use it later. And so this cellular respiration is going to be an idea of releasing energy to store it in this particular unit that our cells can use for whatever it is that they have need of. So that'll be cell respiration. That one's more destructive, if you will, rather than constructive like photosynthesis is. Now, cellular respiration is going to be done by all life. This is not specific to guys that do photosynthesis. This is not specific to autotrophs, because autotrophs do photosynthesis, but they also do cell respiration. So don't fall into that trap where you assume that, autotrophs do photosynthesis and then ultimately heterotrophs do cellular respiration. Everyone has to do cell respiration. Everyone has to be able to break stuff down to capture energy into a more usable form. It's just autotrophs also build the stuff that they break down, whereas we eat the stuff that we break down. So when you look at this image here, at the top we've got plants, algae, all the guys that do photosynthesis, these autotrophs. And you'll notice that they do a bunch of photosynthesis, that's shown here in green. They also do some cell respiration, that's shown here in the red. On the bottom, we've got heterotrophs, and you'll see we only do cellular respiration. We do a fair amount of it, but that's all we do. Now, ATP I want to bring up because this is going to be a critical guy for cellular energy. This is what all cellular processes have evolved to use to provide energy to them. So it's kind of like if you have a whole bunch of electronics that need electricity. It'd be nice if they all use the exact same form of electricity, let's say AA batteries. So that way you knew if you need to power anything in your house, you knew exactly what it took to make that happen. It's much more efficient than needing 10 or 20 different types of batteries to make all the things necessary function. That adds unnecessary complexity. So with cells, what we see is ATP is the universal guy that powers stuff. And all this is it's a modified nucleotide. If you remember adenine from previous biology classes, this is part of our DNA and RNA. So this is going to be an adenosine is what we call this part of it. Okay, a nitrogen base and a sugar. And then attached to that, it has 3 phosphate groups. That's the triphosphate. So we've got 1, 2, 3. And it's this last phosphate group that's fairly unstable. It doesn't really want to exist like that. And so we kind of have to force it to attach. But when we let it break away and attach to something else, when we let it leave, it releases a bunch of energy. And we can then transfer that energy it releases to whatever it is that we're trying to energize. So this allows us to power a lot of our endothermic reactions that need energy by allowing this phosphate to be removed and transferred elsewhere. And so that's what you see down here is on the bottom we've got ADP, diphosphate, where this is the kind of inactive, the used up form. And so it only has 2 phosphates. But in the process of going from the top to the bottom, from ATP to ADP, we release energy. So this is going to be a release of energy, all right? And then in the process, we can recharge this, where if we add energy by doing things like breaking down sugars or lipids, which release energy, we can capture energy, okay? And in the process of capturing energy, we can force this ADP, this diphosphate, to add that other phosphate to become triphosphate. So it's a lot like you have to plug in the battery into the wall, that rechargeable battery, to make it absorb energy so that it can go back to its charged state. The charged state is ATP. And then once it's in that charged state, you can allow it to break back down into its uncharged state, go from ATP in ADP, and release energy that we can use for whatever it is we need. So this is really a good analogy to use things like a rechargeable battery. Most of you guys have phones and you're aware of how this works. Our body does a very similar thing using ATP And then, of course, its discharge state, ATP, with a phosphate that's just floating around because we removed it.